What happens when a murder confession isn't the end of a story, but the beginning of a nightmare? When the one who admits to the crime is hiding a secret far more terrible than death itself. This is a story about the lethal illusion of perfection and how the most pristine surfaces can hide the deepest rot. The rain fell in punishing sheets over Oak Haven, Georgia, a relentless late-afternoon deluge that turned the asphalt into a black mirror reflecting a bruised, unforgiving sky. Detective Sandra Collette felt the day's exhaustion settle deep in her bones, a familiar ache that was both physical and psychic. The shift from the weary grind of her routine to the jarring unreality of this call was a physical shock. She pressed the phone to her ear, the tinny voice of dispatch fighting the groan of her old Ford Crown Victoria as it finally coughed to life. As one of the few black detectives in the Oak Haven PD, she was used to fighting battles on multiple fronts. Today had been a particularly grueling one, a 4-hour standoff at a West Side market where a shoplifting accusation had spiraled into a racially charged shouting match. She had been the designated de-escalator, the calm black face sent in to prove the department wasn't biased, a role that always left a bitter taste in her mouth. She was tired of being a symbol. She just wanted to be a cop. "Collette here," she said, her voice raspy with fatigue. The dispatcher's voice, usually a languid drone, was tight and stripped of its bureaucratic calm. "Detective, we have a homicide. Haven Hills." Sandra's posture straightened, the weariness evaporating in a surge of adrenaline. Haven Hills. That wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a statement, a world apart from the cracked pavement and desperate lives she had just left behind. It was a sprawling enclave of old money and new tech fortunes, where ancient oaks dripped Spanish moss over million-dollar mansions set far back from the road, shielded by immaculate hedges. It was a land of silent, electric-powered lawnmowers, of backyard pools shimmering under the Georgia sun, and of white picket fences that were more symbolic than functional. Crime there was the stuff of teenage boredom, vandalism with a can of spray paint, a stolen lawn gnome on a dare. Murder was an alien concept, a vulgarity that belonged to other, lesser parts of the city. "The address is 17 Cedar Street. Initial report is, a father-in-law shot his daughter-in-law." "On my way," Sandra replied, her voice now sharp and focused. She flipped on the siren, its mournful wail cutting through the storm. The sound felt different here, an unwelcome intrusion on the placid quiet. She knew what this meant. A murder in Haven Hills would bring the press out like sharks to blood, and the brass, from the chief down, would be breathing down her neck. A black detective on a high-profile case in the city's whitest, wealthiest sanctuary? This wasn't just an investigation. It was a test, a public performance she couldn't afford to fail. She could already feel the weight of a dozen different expectations settling on her shoulders. The Mitchell family home was an exercise in Southern grandeur, a neoclassical monolith with towering white columns that seemed to hold up the stormy sky itself. It was the American dream, rendered in brick and marble and breathtaking arrogance. But tonight, that dream was a crime scene, fractured by the strobing red and blue of police cruisers and the stark yellow of crime scene tape stretched between two Doric columns. A few neighbors stood at a respectable distance, huddled under expensive-looking umbrellas, their curiosity warring with their ingrained desire to avoid a scene. Sandra parked, pulled the hood of her raincoat over her head, and strode toward the house, her boots sinking slightly into the perfect sodden lawn. A young, freckle-faced officer, Parker, met her on the sweeping veranda. The victim, a young woman, Amelia Mitchell, her father-in-law, Thomas Mitchell, and the mother-in-law, Vivian Mitchell, she's in there too. He was nervously rubbing a damp notepad with the sleeve of his uniform. "Detective Collette, I was first on scene." His eyes, wide and blue, darted around, unaccustomed to reporting to a woman, let alone a black woman, in a situation this grave. He seemed more unnerved by her presence than by the homicide itself. Call came in at 15:30 from a neighbor, Mr. Abernathy next door, heard a gunshot, 3 people inside, the victim, a young woman, Amelia Mitchell, her father-in-law, Thomas Mitchell. He confessed, ma'am, just sat there and said he did it. And the mother-in-law, Vivian Mitchell, she's in there too. The confession came too fast, too neatly. Sandra's internal alarms, honed by a decade of dealing with liars, cheats, and killers, began to ring. People didn't just murder a family member and then sit calmly waiting for the police. as if they'd merely spilled wine on the carpet. They panicked, they ran, they concocted frantic, unbelievable stories. This level of calm was either the mark of a sociopath or a man playing a part. Sandra nodded, her face an unreadable mask. "Secure the perimeter, Parker. No one in or out without my say-so. Keep Abernathy on ice. I'll want to talk to him later." After pulling on booties and gloves, she crossed the threshold. The opulence inside was breathtaking. A 2-story marble foyer, a crystal chandelier dripping light like frozen tears, antique furniture that probably cost more than her house. It all created a grotesque, surreal contrast to the scene in the living room. On an immaculate cream-colored Persian rug, a young woman lay still, a dark, blossoming stain of red spreading from her chest. The blood was a vulgar splash of reality in a room that felt like a museum exhibit. In a leather wingback chair sat a middle-aged man, Thomas Mitchell. At the far window, his wife Vivian stood. Positioned as if he were observing a piece of art, sat a middle-aged man, Thomas Mitchell. His suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His eyes were red-rimmed but unnervingly dry. At the far window, his wife Vivian stood with her arms wrapped around herself, a statue of contained shock, staring out at the rain-lashed garden. "Mr. Thomas Mitchell?" Sandra's voice cut through the thick, suffocating silence. He lifted his head. He didn't look angry or remorseful, just hollowed out, like a building with its foundation removed. "Yes, that's me," he answered in a dull monotone, the voice of a man reciting facts from a report. "I shot my daughter-in-law, Amelia Mitchell. The gun is on the coffee table." He gestured with a slight nod of his head. He said it with the emotional investment of a man confirming his lunch order. Sandra looked at him, then at the elegant, silver-plated revolver lying on the glass-top table, a single spent cartridge beside it. She looked at the blood soaking into the priceless rug. She looked at the woman by the window, who hadn't moved a muscle. A deep, cold certainty settled in her gut. This was too simple. This was a script, and in her experience, cases that were too simple were always the most complicated. This confession wasn't an answer. It was a wall built of stone and silence, and she was going to have to tear it down, brick by painful brick. Why does a father remain silent as his son screams for a reason, for any reason, behind the murder of his wife? Is that silence born of guilt, or is it a shield for a truth even more devastating? The question hung in the air of the opulent living room, more palpable than the scent of gunpowder. The room was a study in contrasts. The air itself was thick and cloying, a mixture of damp wool from the rain-soaked uniforms, the faint, acrid scent of a discharged weapon, and the primal, metallic tang of blood. The magnificent crystal chandelier overhead, a relic of a more gracious time, now cast a cold, clinical light on the modern tragedy below, making the scene feel like a diorama in a museum of suburban horror. The stark difference between the feigned composure of the older couple and the raw, unadulterated grief that was about to erupt would soon reveal the deep, hidden cracks in the family's perfect facade. Sandra was acutely aware of the 2 patrolmen standing against the wall, their gazes shifting between the suspects and her. She could read their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken them aloud. What does she know about people like this? Can she really handle a case of this magnitude in this neighborhood? She ignored their unspoken judgment, their silent condescension, and focused her entire being on the people at the heart of the storm. "Mr. Mitchell, you have the right to remain silent." "I understand," Thomas said, "but I don't want a lawyer, not yet." Sandra recited, her voice a flat, professional instrument against the room's emotional chaos. It was a necessary ritual, a shield of procedure. "I understand," Thomas said, his voice as devoid of inflection as a machine. "I don't deny it. But I don't want a lawyer, not yet." The "not yet" was a curious addition, a hint of some future calculation. "Can you tell me why you did it?" Sandra pressed, keeping her tone neutral. Thomas's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing under his smooth-shaven skin. His gaze drifted to a point on the far wall, just past Sandra's shoulder, as if focusing on a memory only he could see. "No, not now." Sandra held his gaze for a moment longer before turning her attention to the woman by the window. "Mrs. Mitchell?" "Mrs. Mitchell?" Vivian started. "I was upstairs. In our bedroom, I heard the shot." Vivian started, a barely perceptible flinch, as if shaken from a deep protective trance. Vivian Mitchell, she introduced herself, her voice a thin, reedy thing that seemed ill-suited to the grandeur of the room. It trembled, but her eyes, like her husband's, were completely, unnaturally dry. It was a small, sharp detail that snagged in Sandra's mind. Grief had many faces, but this bone-dry composure felt like a mask. I was upstairs, in our bedroom. I heard the shot. I ran down and... She gestured vaguely toward the body on the floor, her hand fluttering like a wounded bird. "Did you call the police?" Sandra asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "No, the neighbor did. Mr. Abernathy. He heard the shot and came over. Thomas was just sitting there, and I was in shock." Shock. Sandra wrote the word down, but she didn't believe it. This wasn't shock. This was a performance of shock, carefully curated. Just then, as if on cue, the heavy front door flew open and a young man burst into the foyer. "Let me through! This is my house!" Soaked to the bone and wild-eyed, he burst into the foyer. "Let me through! This is my house! What the hell is going on?" John Mitchell, the husband, the son, the unsuspecting victim of a tragedy he couldn't yet comprehend, had come home. Sandra signaled the officer in the hall with a quick, sharp nod. The officer reluctantly let John pass. He stormed into the living room, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. Then his eyes fell upon the still form on the floor, and all the color drained from his face. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. The name was a prayer and a question. "Amelia!" He lunged toward her, a primal sound of grief tearing from his throat, but Sandra moved swiftly, positioning herself between him and the body. "Are you John Mitchell?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. "Yes, I'm her husband," he choked out, his eyes locked on the bloodstain, trying to push past her as if he could somehow undo what had been done. "What happened? Who did this?" His frantic, horrified eyes scanned the room, sweeping past the uniformed officers, past Sandra, and landing finally on his father, sitting motionless and silent in the wingback chair. The confusion in John's eyes morphed into a dawning, sickening, world-shattering horror. "Dad!" John's voice was a strangled gasp. "Dad! No! It wasn't you! Tell me it wasn't you!" The word was an accusation and a plea. "Dad! No! It wasn't you! Tell me it wasn't you!" Thomas Mitchell didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He simply lowered his head further, as if the weight of his son's gaze was a physical burden, crushing him into the expensive leather of the chair. That silence was a confession more damning and more absolute than any words could ever be. "Why?" John shrieked, the sound raw and animalistic. He began to struggle as two officers, moving with practiced efficiency, grabbed his arms. "Why did you kill her? What did she ever do to you?" "John, calm down," Vivian said softly, taking a step toward her son. Her voice was a placid ripple on the surface of a violent storm. "Mom," John stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "Do you know why? Tell me." His grief momentarily eclipsed by a new sharp suspicion. "Do you know why? Tell me." Vivian shook her head, her eyes finally averting his, skittering away to the safety of the rain-streaked window. I don't know, son." Sandra directed the officers to take John to another room. The family had to be separated, their stories isolated before they could be contaminated by one another. She followed them into the kitchen, a gleaming, sterile space of stainless steel and granite. John collapsed onto a bar stool at the massive center island, burying his head in his hands. His shoulders heaved with silent, racking sobs, but no tears came. The shock was too profound, a cataclysm that had vaporized emotion, leaving only a hollow void. "Mr. Mitchell," Sandra began gently, sitting opposite him, "I'm so very sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you some questions." John looked up, his eyes red and raw, a roadmap of pain. "I don't understand. Why would my father do this? He and Amelia, they always got along. Never a fight, nothing." He spoke of a normal morning, of plans to visit the lake that weekend, of saving for their own house. He was painting a portrait of a perfect life, a Norman Rockwell image. But on the expensive Persian rug in the other room, Amelia Mitchell's blood had painted a masterpiece of a very different kind, a brutal, abstract expression of lies, secrets, and violence. Sandra knew that in this house, truth and fiction were woven together into a tight, ugly tapestry, and it was her job to pull it apart, thread by painful, bloody thread. Why would a successful, disciplined businessman like Thomas Mitchell, a man whose life was reportedly governed by routine and order, break a decades-long pattern and come home 4 hours early on the exact day his daughter-in-law was murdered in his house? Was it a tragic one-in-a-million coincidence, or was it a crucial, calculated link in a deadly chain of events? The question pulsed in Sandra's mind as she sat across from the broken man who was Thomas Mitchell's son. The Mitchell's kitchen was cold and impersonal, a space designed for show more than for living. The harsh light from the recessed ceiling fixtures gleamed off the polished granite countertops, reflecting John's shattered face like a distorted mask of grief. Outside, the rhythm of the rain was a constant, mournful drumbeat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a somber soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. Sandra transitioned from the seemingly benign testimonies of the family members to a growing, chilling realization that each person was withholding a crucial piece of the truth, each lie a brushstroke in a masterpiece of deceit. She kept her voice low and even, a professional calm in the eye of an emotional hurricane, knowing that every pause, every flicker of an eyelid could be a clue. He's always at the office until 7. Always. I don't know why he came home so early. Sandra continued her questioning of John, her pen moving steadily across the page of her notepad. Yes, he replied, his voice distant, lost. He's always at the office until 7. Always. It's a running joke in the family. You can set your watch by my dad. I don't know why he came home so early. And your mother? She handles the house, does some charity work with the Historical Society. She's usually home during the day. That's her routine. Sandra made a note. A father who breaks routine. A mother who is always present. A daughter-in-law who was supposed to be at the art gallery where she curated, but was home instead. 3 people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps, for one of them, it was exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Did your wife have access to the safe where the gun was kept? John looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his grief-stricken eyes. No, only my father. He inherited it from his father, and he was always incredibly strict about his firearms. He called it respecting the weapon. Amelia wouldn't have even known the combination. Did your wife ever express fear of any family members? Any arguments? Any tension you might have overlooked? No, never, John insisted, shaking his head with a certainty that was heartbreaking in its naivete. He then buried his face in his hands again, his voice muffled. We were happy here. God, we were so happy. At least, I thought we were. Leaving John in the care of a uniformed officer who looked profoundly uncomfortable, Sandra returned to the living room. The air was thick with the scent of the crime scene unit's chemical sprays. Amelia's body was gone, but the chalk outline on the rug remained, a stark, ugly wound in the room's perfection. Thomas Mitchell was being led out the front door, his hands cuffed behind his back. As he passed the threshold, he cast one long, unreadable look back at his wife, who stood stiffly by the fireplace, her back to him. Vivian didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him, a small, deliberate act of erasure that screamed volumes. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you some more questions in private. Tell me what happened today from the beginning, Sandra asked. Sandra said after Thomas was gone, her voice cutting through Vivian's feigned bubble of shock. They moved to a small library off the main hall. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that looked as if they had never been touched, props in the stage play of a wealthy life. Vivian sat on the very edge of a Chesterfield sofa, her hands clenched into tight fists in her lap. She looked composed, almost eerily calm, a woman holding herself together with sheer force of will. Tell me what happened today, from the beginning, Sandra asked, sitting in a wingback chair opposite her. I was home all day, Vivian began, her voice a rehearsed monotone. I did some gardening in the morning, before the rain started. Amelia was supposed to be at the gallery. They were installing a new exhibition. Thomas was at the office. Around 3 I heard the front door, but I didn't think anything of it. I assumed it was the delivery service, or perhaps Amelia had come home early. I was upstairs in our bedroom, folding laundry. Then I heard voices downstairs, then a scream, and then a gunshot. The words sounded plausible, a neat and tidy sequence of events. But Sandra immediately spotted the deadly flaw, the lie that unraveled the whole story. Officer Parker's report had been crystal clear. The neighbor, Abernathy, had heard a single distinct gunshot, nothing else. The houses in Haven Hills were set far apart. soundproofed. A scream might not have carried, but a lie could be detected from a mile away. A scream? Sandra probed. Are you certain you heard a scream, Mrs. Mitchell? Her eyes fixed on Vivian, watching for the tell. Are you certain you heard a scream, Mrs. Mitchell? Vivian blinked, a flicker of panic, quick as a hummingbird's wing in her eyes. I think so. It all happened so fast. The sounds, they were all jumbled together. I ran down, and Amelia was on the floor. Thomas was in the chair with the gun. What did he say to you? Nothing. He just looked at me, and then he looked away. How would you describe Amelia's relationship with your son? They were in love, Vivian said, the words rushing out too quickly, too perfectly. John has always been so traditional. He wanted a big family, children. Amelia, she wanted that too. Sandra noted the slight, almost imperceptible hesitation before the last phrase, a momentary glitch in the programming. And your relationship with Amelia? Yes, you could say that, like a mother and daughter. You were close, John said. Yes, good, another too quick reply. She was a sweet girl. We spent a lot of time together, shopping, yoga, the things women do. So you were like a mother and daughter? Sandra asked, deliberately using the classic trope. Vivian's gaze drifted away toward the rain-lashed windows. Yes, you could say that, like a mother and daughter. There was something in the intonation of that phrase that put Sandra on high alert. It didn't sound like affection, it sounded like a carefully constructed alibi, a line she had practiced. Mrs. Mitchell? Sandra's tone sharpened, becoming less conversational and more interrogative. Does your husband's behavior strike you as strange? This is a man you've lived with for over 20 years. He suddenly murders his daughter-in-law for no apparent reason and refuses to explain it. Doesn't that seem odd to you? Vivian fidgeted with the hem of her expensive silk blouse, her composure finally beginning to crack. I don't know what to say. It all feels like a nightmare. Thomas has been under a lot of stress at work. Are you aware of any problems in your family? Financial issues, affairs, hidden conflicts? No, nothing like that, Vivian snapped, a flash of irritation breaking through her calm facade. We were fine. We are a good family. Sandra knew with absolute certainty that this woman was lying. Or, at the very least, she was curating the truth, presenting a version of events that was as carefully decorated and artificial as the room they were sitting in. Her composure, her rehearsed answers, her evasion, they were all red flags. The picture-perfect family that John and Vivian were painting had too many mismatched colors, too many brush strokes that didn't align. And Sandra believed the first crack in this false masterpiece was the elegant, terrified woman sitting right in front of her. When human words are a web of lies, a tangled mess of half-truths and carefully constructed facades, can the primal, incorruptible instinct of an animal unearth the truth? Detective Sandra Collette, facing a wall of elegant silence and sophisticated deceit, decided to place her faith in a four-legged partner, hoping it could smell the one thing she couldn't see, the deeply buried motive. Back at the Oak Haven Police Department, the atmosphere was as tense as the crime scene had been. The building buzzed with the news. A murder in Haven Hills was like a royal scandal. It was all anyone could talk about. Captain Harris, a weary old-school white cop, called Sandra into his office. Find it, Collette. The room smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and his quiet, ever-present skepticism. He had never been overtly hostile to her, but she always felt his doubt, a subtle but persistent belief that she wasn't quite up to the task, especially a task this big. Collette, what have we got? He asked, leaning back in his creaky chair, his tone implying he expected very little. The chief has called me twice already. The Mitchells are big donors to the policeman's ball, you know. Sandra stood straight, refusing to be intimidated. She gave him the rundown, her voice a calm, professional counterpoint to his agitation. Thomas Mitchell confesses to the act, but offers no motive. His wife Vivian provides a contradictory and deeply suspicious testimony. The son, John, is shattered and, by all appearances, completely clueless. No family feuds, no inheritance disputes, nothing obvious, Captain. By all external accounts, they were a perfect family. A man doesn't kill his daughter-in-law for nothing, Harris grumbled, echoing the sentiment he'd voiced earlier, this time with a hint of accusation, as if Sandra's inability to instantly produce a motive was a personal failing. He picked up a pen and pointed it at her. "Find it, Colette. The press is turning this into a circus. I don't want any leaks, and I don't want this department to look incompetent. Do you understand?" Sandra understood the subtext perfectly. "Don't embarrass me. Don't make me regret giving you this lead." Leaving his office, she felt the pressure mount, a physical weight on her shoulders. She could practically hear the whispers from some of her colleagues down the hall, the quiet bets on how long it would take before Harris pulled her off the case and gave it to one of the good old boys. She had to solve this, not just for Amelia's justice, but for her own self-respect, for every other cop of color who would come after her. Her investigation, which had been based on human testimony, had hit a wall of deceit. It was time to shift from relying on what people said to discovering what they had so desperately hidden. Her formal interrogation of Thomas at the station was a study in futility. He sat in the small gray room, a man of immense power brought low, yet he projected an aura of impenetrable calm. He simply repeated the same phrase, his voice a monotone. "I'll wait for my lawyer." His demeanor wasn't defiant. It was strangely, unnervingly resigned, as if he had already accepted his fate and was merely waiting for the formalities to conclude. "Some things are better left buried," was the last cryptic thing he said, before falling completely silent. His gaze fixed on the two-way mirror, as if he could see right through it. Armed with a comprehensive search warrant, Sandra returned to the Mitchell residence later that evening. The house was now eerily quiet, a grand, empty shell filled with ghosts. Vivian was there, a condition of the warrant, and her fear was now a palpable thing in the air, a cold spot in every room she entered. "Amelia and John's room is upstairs, second door on the right," she said, her voice a thin thread, before retreating to the sunroom like a frightened wraith. The young couple's room was bright and spacious, decorated in tasteful shades of blue and cream. But it felt cold now, haunted by a life cut short. Sandra and her team began a methodical, grid-by-grid search. They were no longer just looking for obvious clues. They were looking for the hidden, the erased, the secret heart of the crime. Closets full of expensive clothes, dressers filled with neatly folded silks, a laptop on a writing desk. Everything was examined, bagged, and tagged. "Detective!" an officer called out from across the room. "Found this tucked away in the back of her lingerie drawer." He handed Sandra a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover a soft, buttery cream color. A diary. Sandra put on a fresh pair of gloves and opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping, and full of life. Most entries were mundane, the chronicle of a young, privileged woman's life. Notes about art exhibitions, dinner plans, frustrations with a supplier for the gallery. But then, Sandra found the entries that changed everything. "V was especially tender today. She is my only sanctuary." October 12th. Jay brought up kids again today. He has this beautiful, simple vision of our future. A house, a dog, 2.5 children. I smiled and nodded, but inside, I was screaming. I don't know how much longer I can put off this conversation. He doesn't realize I'm not ready. He doesn't realize I can't tell him the real truth. November 3rd. V was especially tender today. We had the whole day to ourselves while the men were at work. She read poetry to me in the garden. Sometimes I think she's the only one who sees the real me, the person underneath the polite smiles and perfect wife routine. She is my only sanctuary. December 1st, 3 years. 3 years today since our secret began. Sometimes I wonder if it would be better to tell Jay everything, to rip off the bandage and let the wound breathe. But V is terrified it would destroy the family. She's right, of course. The fallout would be catastrophic. But these lies, they are eating me alive. Vivian. Sandra's suspicion, a cold knot in her stomach, solidified into a sickening certainty. Amelia was having a secret long-term affair with her mother-in-law. This was the motive, or at least the beginning of it. But a diary was only half the story. Sandra needed the proof that Thomas must have found. Some things are better left buried. What was he talking about? A video? A photograph? Where was it? Sandra ordered her team to tear the house apart, with a focus on Thomas's private spaces. They searched his office, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather. They checked every book, every file, even looking for false bottoms in the drawers. Nothing. They swept the living room again, looking for hidden cameras, loose floorboards. Still nothing. Thomas had confessed to the murder, but he had seemingly obliterated the reason why, taking the why with him to his jail cell. "We're missing something," Sandra said to Parker. "Parker, call the K9 unit," her frustration mounting. He hid it, something small, something they wouldn't think to look for. She looked around the pristine, silent house. "Parker, call the K9 unit. I want an electronics detection dog in here. Now." Parker looked surprised, his pen hovering over his notepad. "A K9 unit? For an indoor homicide detective? We've already swept the place." "We swept it with human eyes," Sandra said firmly, ignoring his incredulous look. "We see what we expect to see. A dog doesn't have expectations. It has a nose. We need a nose that can find the truth." Officer Miller, the handler, led a large, formidable German shepherd named Shadow into the mansion. Half an hour later, a K9 unit vehicle pulled up, its arrival a starkly utilitarian intrusion on the manicured elegance of Cedar Street. Officer Miller, the handler, led a large, formidable German shepherd named Shadow into the mansion. The dog was all business, his intelligent eyes scanning the scene. "What's he looking for, detective?" Miller asked, his respect for Sandra clear. He'd worked with her before and trusted her instincts. "Anything out of place," Sandra replied. "Specifically, electronics, flash drives, memory cards, hidden recorders. Anything with a unique scent of polymers and rare earth metals, hidden where it shouldn't be." Shadow began his work. He moved with a silent, focused grace, sweeping through the opulent living room, indifferent to the expensive decor. He moved into Thomas's office. He circled the heavy oak desk, his nose twitching. He sniffed at the baseboards, the bookshelves, and then suddenly he sat down beside an old, worn leather armchair and let out a single, sharp, expectant bark. In the corner of the room, he sat down and let out a single, sharp, expectant bark. "He's got something," Miller said, his voice tense with anticipation. Sandra approached. The chair looked perfectly normal, a comfortable reading chair that had seen better days. She ran a gloved hand over the cushions, pressing down, feeling for any lumps. Nothing. But Shadow remained seated, his nose pointed insistently at the underside of the right armrest. Sandra knelt down, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Tucked deep into a fold of the leather, almost invisible, was a tiny, expertly stitched seam that didn't match the rest of the chair's upholstery. Using a small knife from her evidence kit, Sandra carefully slit the stitches. Deep inside the dense foam padding, her fingers touched something small, hard, and rectangular. She carefully extracted it, a tiny micro SD card wrapped in a small piece of velvet cloth, and stared at the object in her gloved palm, a tiny micro SD card wrapped in a small piece of velvet cloth that smelled faintly of a woman's expensive floral perfume. Amelia's perfume. Thomas had hidden the evidence of his motive, but in his haste, or perhaps in a moment of sentimental cruelty, he couldn't erase her scent. Sandra held the memory card, feeling the immense weight of the truth it contained. The hunt was over. The performance was about to begin. What could be on that tiny, fragile piece of plastic and silicone that a man would be willing to go to prison for life to conceal? As Sandra inserted the card into her laptop, she knew she wasn't just about to watch a video. She was about to witness the precise, recorded moment a family's soul was torn apart, the digital ghost of a crime that would haunt them all forever. The briefing room, Sandra, Captain Harris, and Vivian Mitchell. At the Oak Haven Police Department was as silent as a tomb, a stark, windowless box that seemed to amplify the tension. The only sounds were the low hum of the laptop's fan and the strange, shallow breathing of the three people present: Sandra, Captain Harris, and Vivian Mitchell. After finding the card, Sandra had summoned Vivian to the station to clarify a few details. It was a request she couldn't refuse, and she had arrived with her lawyer, a slick, expensive-looking man who now sat beside her, looking profoundly uneasy. Vivian herself sat at the table, her face a pale, bloodless mask, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked like a defendant awaiting a verdict, her composure a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea of panic. The discovery of the card had shifted the power dynamic completely. Sandra was no longer working from suspicion based on clues. She was about to confront Vivian with irrefutable visual proof, Mrs. Mitchell, Sandra said, her voice low, but carrying an immense, unshakable authority that filled the small room. We found what your husband tried to hide. I think it's time you told me the whole truth. Your lawyer can advise you, but he cannot change what is on this card. Vivian swallowed hard, a visible tremor running through her. I told you about our relationship. We were in love. In love? Captain Harris, who had insisted on being present, interjected with a snort of derision, his voice dripping with disgust. You were sleeping with your own son's wife in his father's house, and you call it love? What kind of people are you? Captain, Sandra cut in, her sharp gaze silencing him. This was not the time for moralizing. This was the time for facts. Let me handle this. She turned her full attention back to Vivian. Let's start again. This video will show us what happened, but I want to hear it from you first. Your cooperation now will look far better than being contradicted by a videotape later. The lawyer whispered something in Vivian's ear. Tears finally began to stream down her face, carving clean paths through her expensive foundation. She told the story again, this time with the agonizing, humiliating detail of a confession. She spoke of the profound loneliness in her marriage to Thomas, a man she respected but had never truly connected with, a man who saw her as another beautiful acquisition, a hostess for his business dinners. She described Amelia's arrival not just as a burst of color, but as a lifeline in a drowning sea. Amelia had listened to her, seen her, not as Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, but as Vivian. She confessed to the first kiss, a spontaneous, desperate act in the quiet of the garden one afternoon, an act that had irrevocably changed everything. It was my idea, Vivian admitted, her voice breaking, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally shattering. The idea for Amelia to marry John. It was monstrous, I know that now, but I was so afraid of losing her, of the scandal. I thought if she became part of the family, a permanent fixture in our lives, we could be together, secretly. It seemed so safe. I used my own son as a cover for my affair. The horrific confession hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Even Harris was silent now, his blustering morality momentarily stunned by the sheer, calculated selfishness of the act. Sandra felt a reluctant, clinical pity for this woman, so ensnared by her own terrible decisions. But Amelia wanted to go public, didn't she? Sandra asked, guiding her back to the timeline. Yes, Vivian nodded, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. Over the last few months, she became more and more insistent. She was young, she had her whole life ahead of her. She said she was tired of the lies, of the sneaking around. She wanted us to be together, openly. She wanted us to tell John and Thomas everything, for us to get divorced, and to start a new life somewhere else. She was going to tell John the truth, on that very day. The computer beeped softly. The video files were loaded. Sandra said nothing more, simply turning the laptop to face Vivian and clicking on the last file, dated the day of the murder. The screen lit up. Vivian and Amelia were on the sofa. But then a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Thomas Mitchell. The image of the Mitchells' living room, filmed from a high, hidden angle, probably from a device disguised on the mantelpiece. Vivian and Amelia were on the sofa. There was no sound, but their body language was a deafening shout. Amelia was arguing passionately, her hands animated. Vivian was shaking her head, her posture a portrait of desperation. Then, Amelia took Vivian's hands, looked into her eyes, and they kissed, a kiss of deep, wrenching intimacy. The kiss quickly became more than a kiss. They began to undress each other, a slow, languid dance of forbidden love, right there on the living room sofa. But then a shadow fell across the doorway in the corner of the frame. It was Thomas Mitchell. He stood frozen, a briefcase in his hand, his face a horrifying, slow-motion canvas of disbelief, then a deep, wounding pain, and then a chilling, cold fury that seemed to bleach all the warmth from his features. Sandra fast-forwarded through the most intimate scenes, feeling like an intruder, an uncomfortable voyeur to this domestic tragedy. She slowed it down again as Thomas silently turned and walked away, disappearing from the frame. A few minutes later, Vivian and Amelia's encounter ended. Amelia stood and began to dress. Vivian said something to her, and Amelia leaned down for one last, lingering kiss. And then, the most horrific part began. As Amelia walked toward the doorway, Thomas reappeared. In his hand, he held the elegant silver revolver. Presumably to leave, Thomas reappeared. This time, his briefcase was gone. In his hand, he held the elegant silver revolver. There was a brief, silent exchange. Sandra, an expert at reading lips from surveillance footage, could make out Amelia's words. "Please, Thomas, don't." Thomas raised the gun, a single silent flash of fire. Amelia collapsed, his arm steady. A single silent flash of fire. Amelia collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The video kept rolling, a silent, unblinking witness. Thomas walked over to the body, looked down at her for a long moment, then calmly sat in the wingback chair, placing the gun on the table beside him. A few moments later, Vivian, now fully dressed in a silk robe, ran into the room. She screamed at the sight of Amelia's body, a silent O-shaped hole of horror. She rushed to her, then turned on Thomas, her face a mask of accusation. He said something to her. Vivian froze, her expression shifting from grief to a dawning, absolute terror. Sandra stopped the video. The silence in the room was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. "What did he say to you, Vivian?" "He looked right at me," she choked out. "And he said, 'I saw everything,'" Sandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vivian wiped at the fresh tears streaming down her face. "He looked right at me," she choked out. "And he said, 'I saw everything. You have no idea how lucky you are that's not you lying there. Why did he kill Amelia and not you?" "I don't think he could," Vivian answered, her voice laced with a bitter, horrifying self-awareness. "Despite what I did, in his own way, he loved me. I was his wife, the mother of his son, a part of him. But Amelia, in his eyes, she was just an outsider, a stranger who had betrayed his son and defiled his home." Sandra understood the twisted patriarchal logic, but one last piece needed to fall into place. "You lied to me," she said, her voice flat, accusatory. "You said you were upstairs when you heard the shot, but you were there. You were with Amelia moments before Thomas came home. You left her there alone." "I ran upstairs and hid in the bathroom like a coward. I just left her down there to face him alone." Vivian buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. "I heard his car in the driveway," she confessed, her voice muffled by her hands. "I panicked. I told Amelia to wait, that I'd handle it. I ran upstairs and hid in the bathroom like a coward. I just left her down there to face him alone. When I heard the shot, I knew. I knew I had signed her death warrant." The final truth was exposed, not by words, but by silent, brutal images. It wasn't just a story of an affair and a jealous rage. It was a story of betrayal, of breathtaking cowardice, and of a selfish, desperate love that had led directly to death. Now, Sandra faced her most difficult task, delivering this catastrophic truth to the one person left who was still innocent in this tragedy, John Mitchell. The truth, when it's ugly enough, doesn't just break a heart. It shatters a soul, grinding it down to dust and scattering the remains to the wind. For John Mitchell, the agonizing transition from a grieving husband was a descent into a private hell. Lost in a fog of conventional sorrow, to a man betrayed on a scale so fundamental it defied comprehension, was a descent into a private hell from which he might never truly return. His world wasn't just collapsing, it was being revealed as a lie from its very foundation. Sandra found John at his parents' house, a place that now felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum of secrets, each opulent room a tomb for a different happy memory. He was sitting in the sterile, gleaming kitchen, staring blankly at the polished chrome of a Sub-Zero refrigerator, as if trying to decipher a cryptic message in its reflection. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His eyes were hollowed out, dark pools of grief and confusion. The air was thick with unspoken words and the cloying, funereal scent of lilies from a sympathy bouquet on the counter, their white petals already starting to brown at the edges. Sandra had dreaded this moment more than any other part of the investigation. There is no training, no protocol for telling a man that his entire life, his marriage, his family, his own identity as a husband and a son, has been an elaborate, cruel deception. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her voice gentle but firm, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside him. "We need to talk. I think it's best if we do it at the station. It's more private there." He followed her numbly, without protest, a ghost in his own life story. He moved like an automaton, his body performing the actions of getting up and walking out the door, while his mind was somewhere far, far away. In a small, sterile interview room at the precinct, a place designed for confessions and devoid of comfort, Sandra sat across from him at a simple metal table. The only sound was the incessant low buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, a sound that seemed to drill into the raw nerves of the moment. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear," she said, choosing her words with surgical precision. She owed him the dignity of the unvarnished truth. To soften the blow would be just another kind of lie, and he had lived with enough of those. "But you deserve to know what really happened. You deserve to know why." John just nodded, his face tense, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I'm ready," he said, though his voice was thin and reedy. "I just want to know why my father killed Amelia." Sandra took a deep breath, steeling herself, and then she began. She didn't spare him the details. She told him about Amelia's diary, reading a few carefully chosen, anonymized lines that spoke of a secret love. She told him about the secret email account her tech team had recovered from Amelia's laptop, an entire hidden world of correspondence between his wife and his mother, filled with declarations of love, clandestine plans, and shared frustrations. She explained as gently as she could that the relationship had been going on for 3 years, that it had started before he and Amelia were even married, that his wedding, his marriage, had been, for them, a matter of convenience and cover. John listened without moving, his face a stone mask, but Sandra could see a storm of emotions warring just beneath the surface, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw in denial, a deep, wounding pain that seemed to radiate from him in waves, and then a flash of pure, unadulterated anger that made him sit up straighter. Finally, she told him about the surveillance camera and what his father had seen on it. That can't be true," he finally whispered. "Amelia loved me. We were happy." When Sandra had finished, his voice hoarse with a desperate, pleading disbelief. "Amelia loved me. We were happy. I know she loved me." He was clinging to the wreckage of his life, trying to salvage one single piece of it that was real. "I'm sorry," Sandra said softly, the words feeling pitifully, shamefully inadequate. "We have proof, John, the letters, the diary, and the videotape." His head snapped up. "I want to see it," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, demanding, transformed by a desperate need to confront the monster that had devoured his life. "I have to see the tape with my own eyes." Sandra hesitated. The thought of showing him a video of his mother and his wife together, followed by the brutal execution of Amelia by his father, felt like an act of profound, unforgivable cruelty. It was like forcing someone to watch their own soul being murdered. But she also understood his desperate need to see the evidence, to make this unbelievable, surreal nightmare concrete. He needed to see it to believe it, and perhaps to begin the long, impossible process of grieving it. "All right," she agreed reluctantly, her own heart aching for him. "But I'm warning you, this will be hard." She turned the laptop toward him and played the file, delicately fast-forwarding through the most intimate moments, sparing him that much at least. John watched, his face impassive, his body rigid as steel, but when the scene shifted, when his father appeared in the doorway with the gun, a choked, guttural sound escaped his lips. He watched the silent confrontation, the flash of the muzzle, and the way Amelia's body crumpled to the floor. He flinched as if he himself had been shot, his whole body recoiling from the screen. "That's enough," he said, his voice a raw, broken rasp. He turned his head away, his eyes squeezed shut, unable to look at the screen any longer. "I've seen enough." Sandra closed the laptop and waited, the silence in the room now heavy, suffocating, and absolute. She gave him the space to process, to let the catastrophic reality sink in, to drown in it. "My whole life," John finally said, "my whole life has been a lie. My father killed my wife. My wife cheated on me with my own mother." His voice hollow, dead, the voice of a man who had lost everything, including himself. My whole life has been a lie. He looked at Sandra, but his eyes were seeing something far away, the smoldering ruins of his past. My marriage, my family, all of it, a joke. The three people I loved most in this world, they all betrayed me. His voice broke on a sob that seemed to tear its way up from the very depths of his being. My father killed my wife. My wife cheated on me with my own mother. And my mother? He couldn't finish the sentence, a broken, humorless laugh escaping his lips. I'm sorry, Sandra repeated, knowing how meaningless the words were in the face of such absolute, operatic devastation. After a long, shattered silence, John looked up at her, his face aged by a decade in a single hour. What happens now? He asked, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Your father will stand trial for murder, Sandra explained, her voice gentle. His lawyer will likely argue it was a crime of passion. Your mother is the key witness for the prosecution. And me? John asked bitterly, a profound emptiness in his eyes. What am I supposed to do now? Sandra had no answer. There was no procedure, no rulebook for this. The law could deal with the killer and the witness, but it had no power to mend a life so completely and utterly broken. It could only document the wreckage. For Thomas Mitchell, the transition from a cold, silent killer, a man hiding behind the shield of legal rights, to a man laid bare by his own family's betrayal, was not one of remorse, but of chilling, resolute justification. The interrogation room, which had previously felt like a stage for his stoic silence, now felt smaller, the air charged with a truth that was finally, poisonously, out in the open. Thomas sat across from Sandra, no longer hiding. The discovery of the tape had not broken him. It had, in a strange way, liberated him. He no longer had to protect the secret. He could now defend the act. We know what really happened, Mr. Mitchell, Sandra began. We've seen the tape. Her voice even, devoid of accusation. She was no longer seeking a confession, but an explanation. We've seen the tape. Thomas looked at her, a long, appraising stare, and then gave a slow, tired nod. A flicker of something, relief, resignation, passed through his eyes. So, it's all coming out then. The whole sordid mess. Why didn't you tell us this from the start? Sandra asked. It could be a mitigating factor. Murder in a state of passion, provoked by the discovery of adultery. Any decent lawyer would argue that. And drag my son through that public humiliation? Thomas answered quietly, his voice heavy with a strange, protective sorrow that was both paternal and deeply arrogant. Have him sit in a courtroom and listen to the details of how his wife and his mother betrayed him? I may be a killer, detective, but I am still a father. I was trying to shield him from this filth. Even if it meant a longer sentence for me. Some things are worse than prison. But now that you've found the tape, he sighed, a man defeated not by the law, but by the exposure of his family's profound shame. It doesn't matter anymore. The damage is done. Tell me what happened that day, Sandra prompted, leaning forward slightly. In your own words, help me understand. Thomas leaned back in the hard plastic chair, his eyes unfocused, as if he were watching the events play out on an invisible screen on the gray cinder block wall behind her. Understand? He scoffed softly. You can't understand unless you've built something, detective. Built it from nothing, with your own two hands. A business, a name, a family, and then you watch it being eaten from the inside out by a cancer. He took a deep breath. I started suspecting something months ago, he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. Vivian had changed. She became distant, absent-minded. There was a light that had gone out in her eyes, or maybe a different one had been lit. She'd leave the house for hours, saying she was going shopping or meeting friends from the charity league, but she'd come back empty-handed with vague answers. And I saw the way she looked at Amelia. It wasn't the way a mother-in-law looks at her son's wife. It was possessive, covetous. He paused, gathering his thoughts, his face a mask of remembered pain. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, the jealousy of an old man who feels his wife slipping away. But the suspicion, it was like a splinter in my mind, a constant low-grade irritation that I couldn't get rid of. Then 2 weeks ago, I put the camera in the living room. It was a simple thing, disguised as a smoke detector. I told myself I just wanted to be proven wrong. I wanted to prove to myself that I was imagining things. that I was the one who was crazy. But you weren't, Sandra said quietly. No, Thomas shook his head, a flicker of the old raw pain in his eyes. For the first few days, nothing unusual. But then I started noticing things. How they'd sit too close together on the sofa when they thought no one was home. How their hands would touch by accident and linger for a fraction of a second too long. Little things that could be explained away as female friendship, if it weren't for the looks they gave each other when they thought no one was watching. And the day of the murder? I had an important client meeting, a merger, cancel at the last minute. The other party had a family emergency. I decided to come home for lunch, go over some paperwork in my study. I didn't expect to find Amelia there. She was supposed to be at the gallery. And I certainly didn't expect to see what I saw. His voice trembled with a rage that was still fresh, still potent. I walked in the front door and I heard sounds, laughter, coming from the living room. I opened the door and saw them, my wife and my son's wife, on our couch, in my house. He clenched his hands into white-knuckled fists on the table. They didn't see me. They were too preoccupied. It was like being stabbed in the heart, but the knife was white-hot. 26 years of marriage, the family I built, the name I protected. It was all a lie, a disgusting, sordid joke being played on me and my son. I couldn't stand to look at it. I walked out without a word, went up to my office and just sat there in my chair. I don't know for how long. An hour, two. I was trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out what to do. My world had tilted off its axis. And then I heard Amelia coming out of the room. Vivian must have stayed upstairs. And something inside me just snapped. A wire broke. All the rage and all the humiliation, all the betrayal. It coalesced into a single, cold, clear thought. This has to end. This infection has to be cut out. I took the gun from the safe, my father's gun, and I went downstairs. She was in the hall, getting ready to leave, humming to herself. I asked her how long it had been going on. She tried to deny it at first, the audacity of it. But when I told her I had seen everything, she didn't even look ashamed. She admitted it, smugly. She told me they'd been in love for 3 years, that Vivian was unhappy with me, that they were planning to tell John everything, and that he would understand because his generation was more enlightened. She was so sure he'd take their side. A hint of his own racial and class prejudice surfaced in his tone as he added, "She had this confidence, a kind of entitlement I never trusted from the day John brought her home. Not our kind of people." That was the last straw. The thought of them turning my own son against me, destroying everything I had ever worked for. I fired. He delivered the last line with a chilling, absolute finality. He wasn't confessing to a crime of passion anymore. He was explaining a calculated act of extermination. In his mind, he had not committed a murder. He had performed a necessary, albeit tragic, surgery. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a patriarch cleansing his house of a sickness. "And Vivian?" Sandra asked, her voice low. "Did you ever consider killing her too?" Thomas was silent for a long, heavy moment, his gaze turning inward. "No," he said, finally shaking his head. "In that moment, I hated her more than I have ever hated another human being. But she is my wife, the mother of my son. She is a part of me, a rotten part, but a part nonetheless. I couldn't. But Amelia? She was an outsider, a disease that came into my family and tried to destroy it from within." Sandra looked at the man before her. He was no longer just a killer. He was a man convinced of his own terrible righteousness, a man who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, all to protect a version of his family, of his honor, that had, in truth, never really existed. And he would go to his prison cell believing, until his dying day, that he had done the right thing. The stately marble-halled Oak Haven courthouse became the stage for a drama that captivated the state and drew national media attention. The trial of Thomas Mitchell was not just about a murder. It was about the spectacular public implosion of a family that had once represented the pinnacle of Southern respectability and quiet wealth. It was a story with all the elements of a Gothic novel: forbidden love, shocking betrayal, and cold-blooded murder in a gilded cage. The media circus was relentless, with satellite trucks lining the street outside the courthouse, and reporters turning the daily procession of witnesses into a grim red carpet. The case laid bare the ugly secrets of the wealthy, and the public, from Oak Haven to the rest of the country, consumed every salacious detail with a ravenous appetite. John Mitchell was conspicuously painfully absent. He had vanished from public life completely, refusing to participate in the trial that would dissect, piece by painful piece, the betrayal of his wife and parents. His lawyer released a short statement requesting privacy, but his absence in the courtroom was a silent, powerful testament to his pain, a void that spoke more loudly than any testimony could. He refused to be a prop in their tragedy. In the courtroom, Thomas Mitchell, dressed each day in a crisp, dark suit, looked less like a defendant and more like a CEO attending a hostile board meeting. He pleaded guilty to the act of killing Amelia, but not to the charge of first-degree murder. His high-priced defense attorney, a silver-tongued Atlanta lawyer named Marcus Thorne, argued that this was a classic crime of passion. He painted a sympathetic portrait of a devoted husband and father, a pillar of the community who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance by the discovery of a shocking, doubly incestuous betrayal. This wasn't a malicious act, Thorne argued to the jury, but the tragic, understandable reaction of a good man who had walked in on an unthinkable scene in his own home. The prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious woman named Carla Rios, methodically dismantled that narrative. She presented a different picture, that of a cold, calculating man, a narcissist whose pride was more important than a human life. She argued that enough time had elapsed between Thomas discovering the affair and the actual shooting for his passion to have cooled. He had time to walk away, to go to his office, to retrieve the weapon from his safe, and to return to confront his victim. This wasn't passion, she thundered in her opening statement. This was premeditation. This was an execution. The key witness for the prosecution, the axis upon which the entire case turned, was Vivian Mitchell. When she took the stand, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. She looked like a ghost of her former self. Gaunt, pale, her expensive Chanel suit hanging off her frail frame. Her blonde hair was lifeless, her eyes huge and haunted in her shrunken face. Speaking in a shaky, barely audible voice, she was forced to recount the entire story of her affair with Amelia. Under Rios's relentless questioning, she admitted to the deceptions, the secret meetings, the manipulation of her own son. She described how Thomas had discovered them on that fateful day. The courtroom was spellbound, a symphony of hushed whispers and reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. "Did you plan to tell your son about your relationship with his wife?" the prosecutor asked, her voice echoing in the silent, wood-paneled room. "Amelia wanted to," Vivian replied quietly, twisting a damp handkerchief in her hands until her knuckles were white. "She said she was tired of living a lie, that we deserved to be happy, openly. But I was afraid." "Afraid of what, Mrs. Mitchell?" "Afraid of losing my son. Afraid of the scandal. Afraid of this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the courtroom, at her own public humiliation. "I told her to wait. I begged her to be patient." "And that's what you were discussing on the day of the murder? This argument over whether to reveal your secret?" "Yes." Vivian nodded, her eyes filling with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. "Amelia insisted it was time to tell John. We argued about it. She said if I wouldn't tell him, she would. And then Thomas came home." She couldn't continue, her words dissolving into a choked sob that was both pathetic and profoundly self-serving. Sandra's testimony was a stark contrast, professional, precise, and devoid of emotion. She was a rock of facts in a sea of turbulent emotion. On the stand, she laid out the timeline of the investigation, from the initial 911 call to the discovery of the diary, and, finally, the memory card. She explained the forensic evidence, the trajectory of the bullet, the distance of the shot. Her testimony was the cold, hard framework upon which the prosecution built its case. The videotape itself, the silent, unblinking witness, was shown to the jury in a closed session. The press and the public were barred, a decision that only fueled the feverish speculation outside. When the 12 jurors filed back into the courtroom an hour later, their faces were a mixture of shock, disgust, and a reluctant, uncomfortable sympathy. They had seen the betrayal, and they had seen the execution. Now they had to decide which was the greater crime. The trial's climax was Thomas Mitchell's final statement. Against his lawyer's advice, he chose to address the court. He rose, not as a broken man seeking pity, but with the strange, unyielding dignity of a fallen king. He stood tall, his hands resting on the defense table, and his voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear. I am not asking for leniency, nor am I trying to justify what I did in the eyes of the law. I took a human life, and for that, I must be punished according to your rules. But I want everyone in this room to understand that, in that moment, I was not just defending my own honor. I was defending the honor of my son. I was defending my home. I was defending my family. Everything I had believed in, everything I had built my entire life, was being defiled and destroyed by the betrayal of the two women closest to me. I am not proud of what I did, he concluded, his gaze sweeping over the silent courtroom, finally resting for a moment on the empty chair where his son should have been. But I do not repent. His words hung in the air, a chilling testament to his unshakable, distorted sense of patriarchal justice. The trial had moved from the cold facts of a crime to the very nature of honor, betrayal, and revenge, leaving the jury to weigh the letter of the law against the raw, primal emotions of a man who believed his castle, his legacy, and his very soul had been under siege. The end of the trial was not a release, not a moment of catharsis or closure, but a final, hollow echo of the tragedy that had preceded it. It marked the definitive transition from the high, public drama of the courtroom to the quiet, desolate landscape of the aftermath, where the survivors were left to wander aimlessly through the ruins of their lives, their futures as shattered as their pasts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, a remarkably short time for a murder trial. The videotape, a piece of evidence so stark and damning, it left little room for interpretation, combined with Thomas's unrepentant final statement, had sealed his fate. The verdict, when it was read by the foreman, was a compromise, a reflection of the jury's conflicted soul, guilty of second-degree murder. It was an acknowledgement of the profound provocation, a small concession to the crime of passion defense, while still holding him accountable for the cold-blooded act of taking a life. It satisfied no one completely. The judge, a stern gray-haired woman named Eleanor Vance, who had seen every form of human misery in her 30 years on the bench, looked down at Thomas with weary eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice devoid of either sympathy or condemnation, "you have taken a life, and in doing so, you have destroyed many others, including your own. Whatever perceived wrongs were done to you, they do not grant you the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner." She sentenced Thomas Mitchell to 15 years in the Georgia state prison system, with the possibility of parole after 10. For a man of his age, wealth, and standing, it was effectively a life sentence. He would likely die behind bars. He received the sentence without flinching, a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his only reaction. After the courtroom cleared and the media scrum, buzzing with the verdict, dissipated to file their stories, Sandra found Vivian standing alone on the wide marble courthouse steps. She was a solitary, almost translucent figure against the imposing stone columns, watching the traffic rush by on the street below, as if it were a scene from another planet. The world was moving on, but she seemed frozen in time, adrift in the wreckage of the life she had so carelessly dismantled. "What will you do now?" Sandra asked, approaching her quietly. Her professional duty was over, but a sliver of human compassion, or perhaps just curiosity, compelled her to speak. Vivian turned, and for a moment, Sandra saw not the manipulative adulteress from the trial, but simply a lost, broken woman. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice as fragile as a dry leaf. "I have no idea. John won't speak to me. His lawyer sent me a letter. I'm not to contact him, ever. I've learned he sold his shares in the company back to the board and left town. No forwarding address. He's just gone." She looked down at her hands. "The house is being sold, the contents auctioned off. I have nothing left. No husband, no son, no home." "I'm sorry," Sandra said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. She felt no sympathy for Vivian's choices, but she could feel the profound, empty weight of her consequences. A bitter, humorless smile touched Vivian's lips. "I'm sorry, too. God, I am so sorry. But it's all my fault, isn't it? Every last bit of it. If I hadn't been so weak, so selfish, if I hadn't given in to my feelings for Amelia, if I hadn't pushed for her to marry John, trapping us all in that horrible lie, if I had just found the courage, just once in my life, to be honest. Her voice trailed off as she turned away, hiding the tears that now fell freely, tears not of performance, but of genuine soul-deep regret. "Goodbye, Detective Collette," she said, her back to Sandra. "Thank you for being decent to me, despite everything. You were just doing your job." Sandra watched her walk away, a woman hunched not by age, but by the crushing, invisible weight of her own guilt and loss. She was a living ghost, destined to be haunted by the choices that had led to this catastrophic end. Thomas was imprisoned by walls of concrete and steel, a punishment with a clear beginning and end. But Vivian was now imprisoned by something far worse, a sentence more tailored and perhaps more cruel than any court could have imposed. The legal chapter was closed, but the human story would continue, a long, quiet, lonely sentence of regret and solitude. The official case file, a thick manila folder filled with forensic reports, transcripts, and photographs of a life violently ended, was closed, stamped, and filed away in the archives of the Oak Haven Police Department. But the ghosts of the Mitchell family lingered, their story becoming a quiet, cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties in Haven Hills, a local legend about the darkness that can fester behind the most pristine facades. The end of the legal process marked the beginning of their individual exiles, a final, definitive scattering from the life they once knew, leaving behind only whispers, vacant real estate, and ruins. A few weeks after the sentencing, an envelope appeared in Sandra's departmental mailbox. It was a single sheet of plain paper in a plain white envelope with no return address. The postmark was from Portland, Oregon, a city of mist and rain 3,000 miles away. The note was short, just a few lines of neat, controlled handwriting that she recognized immediately. "Detective Collette, thank you for finding the truth. I'm starting a new life in a new city. Goodbye. I needed to know, now I need to forget. I'm starting a new life in a new city, under a new name. I hope that one day I can forget everything that happened, though I know that's probably impossible. I just want to live a life where the name Mitchell means nothing. Goodbye." It was unsigned, but the signature of John's pain was all over it. He had erased himself, amputating his past in a desperate attempt to outrun a family tragedy that would forever be a part of his DNA. He was a man in search of an oblivion that could never truly be found, a ghost haunting a new coast, trying to build a future on a foundation of ash. Thomas Mitchell began serving his sentence at the Georgia State Prison in Reedsville. Reports from inside, passed along through the law enforcement grapevine, has described him as a model inmate, quiet, dignified, and completely aloof. He worked in the prison library, kept to himself, and never spoke of his family or his crime. He had accepted his fate with the same stoic, chilling resolve he had shown in the courtroom. It was as if he had performed a difficult but necessary business transaction and was now simply living with the terms of the deal. He was paying his debt to society, but in the private, unassailable court of his own mind, he had simply done what had to be done to protect his name and his son. He would die behind bars, a man who regretted the consequences, but not the act itself. Rumors about Vivian Mitchell were harder to come by, more ephemeral. Some said she had moved to a small, forgotten town on the Florida coast, a place of sun and sand and anonymity. She had taken her half of the considerable Mitchell fortune and disappeared. She lived under her maiden name, a lonely, wealthy woman in a stark, modern house overlooking the ocean. Her only companion, a small dog. She was never seen socializing. She spent her days walking on the beach, a solitary figure always looking out at the horizon, as if waiting for something that would never arrive. She was punishing herself with a life of quiet, luxurious penance, a sentence more tailored and perhaps more cruel than any court could have imposed. 3 lives, all irrevocably ruined by a secret that had festered in the darkness of a perfect home. The forbidden love between Vivian and Amelia, which might have been a source of genuine happiness in a different world, had become a destructive, selfish force because it was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. John's innocent, conventional love for his wife and family had been brutally shattered by a betrayal so complete it bordered on the surreal. and Thomas's rigid patriarchal love for his family name had twisted into a murderous rage, an act of cleansing that had only spread the stain further. The fallout of their secrets had left no survivors, only casualties and various states of living death. The house on Cedar Street was eventually sold to a family from California who knew nothing of the ghosts that lingered in the beautifully appointed rooms. Months later, a cold front pushed down from the north, and Sandra found herself driving through Haven Hills on a different case, a string of sophisticated burglaries targeting the neighborhood's wealthy residents. The rain was falling again, a soft, persistent drizzle that washed the world in shades of gray and muted the vibrant greens of the meticulously kept lawns. As she passed Cedar Street, she yielded to a sudden impulse and turned, her Crown Victoria feeling like a brutish intruder on the serene, winding road. She slowed as she approached number 17. A new, discreetly expensive mailbox stood at the end of the driveway. A child's bicycle lay on its side on the perfect lawn. New life had taken root. But for Sandra, the house would forever be a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded behind its stately, welcoming facade. She pulled her car over to the curb and killed the engine, the only sound the rhythmic swish of her windshield wipers and the gentle patter of rain on the roof. She watched the house for a long time, thinking about the Mitchells. She thought about the intricate, suffocating web of secrets and lies they had woven. Each thread a small betrayal, a minor deception, a quiet compromise with the truth that had ultimately created a shroud that smothered them all. Could it have been different? The question was a futile one, but she couldn't help but ask it. If Vivian had possessed the courage to be honest from the start, to leave a marriage that was making her miserable rather than seeking solace in a forbidden, destructive affair, if society was a different place, a more accepting place, where their love could have existed in the light instead of being forced to hide in the shadows, where it might have had a chance to be noble instead of sordid. If Thomas had been capable of seeing a flawed, frightened human being in Amelia, instead of just a threat to his carefully constructed world of honor and legacy, if John had been told the truth sooner before the lies could take such deep, poisonous root, but history had already been written in blood and tears, and there was no rewriting it. The what-ifs were ghosts, as insubstantial as the mist rising from the damp asphalt. All that remained were the lessons, etched into the memories of those who had witnessed the wreckage, lessons she would carry with her to the next crime scene and the one after that. The truth, Sandra mused as she watched a light turn on in an upstairs window of the house, is a brutal and necessary thing. Secrets are a cancer. They begin as a single tiny cell of deceit, an unspoken word, a small selfish act, and then they metastasize in the darkness, silently, relentlessly, destroying everything from the inside. Love, family, honor, trust, all can be consumed by it. In the end, living in the harsh, unforgiving light of a painful truth is still better than dying in the comforting, suffocating darkness of a perfect lie. The Mitchell family had chosen the darkness, had nurtured it, had mistaken it for safety. And in the end, it had swallowed them whole. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the ghosts of Haven Hills behind her. As she drove back toward the city, toward the next case, the next lie, the next tragedy, she knew this story would stay with her. It was a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones who live in beautiful houses, who wear expensive clothes, and who smile perfect smiles, all while their own hearts are rotting away from the inside out.